It's the dawn of a new century, the year 1600, and Queen Elizabeth I is signing an important piece of parchment. Little did she know, this charter would set into motion events that would shape the future of an entire subcontinent, India. This is the story of the British East India Company, a trading company with humble beginnings that would eventually rule over millions of people, command armies, and rewrite history itself. European countries were desperate for a piece of this market, and the Portuguese, Dutch, and even the French were fierce competitors. But on December 31st, 1600, Elizabeth I granted a group of ambitious English merchants a royal charter, giving them exclusive rights to trade in the East Indies. And thus, the British East India Company was born. But here's the twist. Despite their ambition, the EIC wasn't after India at first. They set their sights on Southeast Asia. Their eyes were on the fabled Spice Islands, the gold mine of pepper and nutmeg. But competition with the powerful Dutch East India Company was brutal. The Dutch had a head start and ruthlessly guarded their monopoly on the spice trade. So, what did the British do? They shifted focus, and slowly but surely, their gaze fell on a rich, sprawling land, India. The year is 1612, and the British East India Company has just secured its first trading post in India, Surat. How, you ask? Through diplomacy and a bit of luck. You see, India was under the rule of the mighty Mughal Empire, and Emperor Jahangir wasn't particularly worried about a few European traders. In fact, he was more than willing to let the English set up shop. What harm could a bunch of merchants do? Little did he know, this decision would have consequences far beyond trade. By the mid-1600s, the East India Company had established 3 major trading posts along the Indian coastline: Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. These trading posts were like mini-cities, complete with forts, warehouses, and bustling markets. But as these outposts grew, so did the company's ambitions. This was no longer just about trade. The East India Company was starting to feel more like a kingdom in the making. Now, this is where things really start to heat up. It's June 23, 1757, and the British East India Company is about to fight a battle that will change everything, the Battle of Plassey. But this wasn't just any battle. No, this was the moment when the East India Company went from being a group of merchants to rulers of vast territories. Robert Clive, a British officer with a sharp mind and ambition to match, led the company's forces. But here's the trick. He didn't win the battle through sheer military might. Instead, Clive had struck a secret deal with Mir Jafar, a discontented general under the Nawab of Bengal. The deal? Helped the British win, and Mir Jafar would become the new Nawab of Bengal. After the Battle of Plassey, the British East India Company was no longer just trading. It was ruling. And with this new power came the right to collect taxes from millions of people across Bengal. The company was now responsible for governing vast parts of India, a job it wasn't exactly equipped to handle. Its focus remained on profit, not people. In 1770, this greed and mismanagement led to disaster. A devastating famine swept through Bengal, killing an estimated 10 million people. The East India Company, more interested in profits than governance, failed to provide relief, and millions starved. This marked a dark chapter in the company's history. Despite this tragedy, the company continued to grow. By the early 1800s, it controlled vast territories across India. It even had its own private army, numbering over 260,000 troops, twice the size of the British Army back in Europe. Imagine that, a company with its own army. But power never comes without resistance. In 1857, after nearly a century of British dominance, the Indian people had had enough. It began with the company's own soldiers, Indian sepoys, who rebelled against their British officers. This wasn't just about one issue. There was growing anger over unfair treatment, oppressive policies, and cultural insensitivity, particularly with the introduction of new rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. The rebellion quickly spread across northern India, with thousands of Indians rising up against the British East India Company. For over a year, fierce fighting ensued. The company's rule hung in the balance. Though the British eventually suppressed the rebellion, it was a turning point. The British government realized that the East India Company had become too powerful and too reckless. In 1858, The British Crown officially dissolved the British East India Company, taking direct control of India, and thus began the era of the British Raj, which would last until India's independence in 1947. The British East India Company had ruled India for over 200 years, but its story didn't end with a bang. It faded into history, remembered as both a symbol of British ambition and exploitation. The corporation that conquered a nation was no more. The story of the British East India Company leaves us with a question. What happens when corporations gain too much power? Today, we live in a world where global companies wield enormous influence over our lives. Could history repeat itself? India, once dominated by the British East India Company, is now a thriving nation of over 1 billion people. Its story is one of resilience, of overcoming the grip of one of history's